nation cursed by years of internal conflict, but blessed with natural resources. For decades, rebels have battled for power. Now the people of South Sudan will decide by ballot whether to split from the north. But a divided Sudan faces a struggle to separate what sustains it, oil and water. 37 years of war has ravaged the nation. After a precarious peace deal, Sudan faces a vote which could plunge it into conflict. Many in the south hope a referendum on splitting from the north will give them the chance to build a new African nation. But others fear it'll spark a bloody battle over the country's resource-rich land. It has 6.7 billion barrels of oil reserves, mostly in the south, plus 105 million hectares of usable farmland, again, mostly in the south. The Nile provides 149 billion cubic meters of water reserves each year. It's also got massive but uncharted mineral wealth. In fact, the land is so rich, one group of economists say a return to war would cost $100 billion in lost opportunity. Al Jazeera's HARU has a story from JUBA in just a moment. First, Mohammed Val has a sentiment from Khartoum.
I'm walking by the Nile, the longest river in the world, stretching thousands of miles across Sudan. Thanks to this river, Sudan's agricultural sector is one of the largest in Africa, contributing 40% of the national GDP and employing 80% of Sudan's workforce. During the last 10 years, however, Sudan became an oil-producing country, exporting 500,000 barrels of oil per day. Easy money from that oil has somehow diverted the government's attention from agriculture. But that situation is about to change. 75% of Sudan's oil comes from the south, and if the south secedes, Sudan will no longer be an oil exporting country. The government will once again have to resort to agriculture. But whether oil or agriculture, the problem has always lied in the distribution of wealth. People in the south, in Darfur, in eastern Sudan, as well as in parts of the north, have always complained they were not given their fair share. And that was one of the main factors behind rebellion and social unrest in this country.
Much of the oil in Sudan is found in the south, but none of it is refined here. It's all done up in the north and then brought back down here in the south by trucks. The comprehensive peace agreement signed back in 2005 says that the oil should be shared equally 50-50 between the north and the south. But officials here suspect that that has not been happening, and they see January's referendum as a chance to be able to control their own resources. They hope most people here in the region vote to become an independent state. Recently, officials from both the north and the south signed an agreement that they'll at least continue to share the oil for the next 6 months. But some people in the international community fear that if no plan is put in place to amicably share this lucrative resources between both sides, even if the south becomes an independent state, it could lead to instability.
So that's how the division of resources is viewed inside the country. A little later in the show, we'll report from Russia, France and China on how and why the superpowers are spending their money and time on Sudan. And an architect of U.S. policy in the region joins us from Washington. Former top U.S. diplomat JENDAYI FRAZER is here. Plus, the people of Sudan let us know what they really want for the future of their country. Al Jazeera's Hassan Ibrahim takes a closer look now at Sudan's lines of division.
Thank you, Jane. Sudan is a very rich country. It is blessed with hundreds of millions of fertile acres and plenty of water resources and significant oil reserves. For millennia, the Sudanese people in the north and south relied on subsistence farming, animal husbandry and primitive commerce as the main sources of their livelihood. With the commercial exportation of oil starting during the final years of the civil war, the parameters of the conflict started to take an international shape. The Sudanese conflict became an international issue where energy-hungry superpowers are competing and squabbling. Suddenly, the border region of Abyei is no longer just an area of dispute. Rather, it became the center of attention of the whole world, with most of Sudan's oil fields being in Abyei. Abyei became such an obstinate issue, and most attention is now focused on this region. When it became impossible to conduct a referendum in Abyei during a conflict over who is eligible to vote, the fate of the region was left to political decisions that would be taken by the National Congress government in Khartoum and the SPLM government in the south. Sudan is also blessed with huge gold, copper and uranium reserves in other parts of the country, some in areas of conflict like Darfur and others in semi-stable regions in the north and the northeast. Another issue of contention are the pastoral grounds of the savannah of southern Sudan, and here again pops the name of Abyei as a contested region between the Missiriya Arabs and the Dinka Nok.
Well, with the division of Sudan on the horizon, another nation looks set to take a share of northern Africa's vast natural resources. South Sudan will swallow much of the Nile River basin and the bulk of the current nation's oil reserves. But even if this country is formally divided, some of its key industries just can't be. Rokhaya Abusharaf, a Sudanese anthropologist, is with us to take a look at why. Let's start off with the country's most precious resource, and of course, that's oil. It has concessions all over the country. Exploration projects led by some of the world's biggest multinationals are ongoing. How concerned do you think they are that if the country splits, their oil fields, their pipelines will become targets?
It's a very well-founded concern, and they ought to be very invested in finding out and finding ways to deal with an unfolding situation in which the very security to conduct out daily business is going to be.
But so far, the majority of exploitable oil fields have all been found in the south, and the refineries to turn the crude into a usable project are up in the north. Now, the country's only pipelines cross from the south to the sea, where it can be exported from Port Sudan in the north. Now, if the state is split in two, the two new countries will have to cooperate if they want to profit. And that's key here, isn't it? For them to be able to coexist so that they can both exploit this incredible oil wealth.
I expect it to happen. It is the only alternative to peacefully coexist, as it is extremely difficult to try to find another way of exporting southern oil at this point.
Let's talk about another very important resource, water. Now, the Nile is not just a lifeline, not just for Sudan, but its 9 African neighbours who are all after a deal on how to share this oil. Are they worried they're going to lose access to it?
I think the worry is about losing the stability and the predictability of what this resource means for the entire region. For Egypt, for example, is the most pertinent example in this case. We do expect that Egypt is going to be invested in southern Sudan as well as in continuing its support for the north.
In the north, 5 poorly maintained dams collect reserves and generate power. But in the west, although Darfur sits on a massive aquifer, it's untapped, so drought is a constant fear. In the south, there's plenty of water, but it is poorly managed, as you were saying. In 1980, here, they began digging one of the world's longest canals to divert water away from a swamp and onto Sudan and Egypt. They built the world's largest moving object to dig the path, but it was destroyed in the civil war and the project failed. Are we going to see a massive influx of Arab nations in the north and African nations in the south as they all start fighting over resources?
Not necessarily. You can expect that some African countries are going to continue a strong relationship with the north and the south. And for Egypt, which is an important player, it is going to continue to be committed to both parties.
Thanks, Rokhaya. So the splits in Sudan society have led to war and now a potential division. And while the US imposed sanctions in response, other nations like China and Russia have invested. In a moment, we'll have reports from Moscow and Beijing. But first, let's go to France, where Jackie Rowland reports on how a regional power views the prospect of another African nation.
Where better to start than the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry, for our look at France's interest in Sudan and the upcoming referendum. What's at stake here for the French goes far beyond the borders of Sudan itself. We're talking about France's strategic interests in the whole of French-speaking Africa. From Old Paris to New Paris and the headquarters of the French oil company Total. The company has been waiting for years to start exploring a site in southern Sudan. Now, at the moment, the whole of Sudan is under US government sanctions, which keep American oil companies out. But all that could change if the South votes for independence. So the French are keen to establish themselves now as the main players. President Nicolas Sarkozy wants to uphold France's influence in Africa in the face of Chinese economic power and challenges by local rebel groups. Instability in Sudan has an impact on neighbouring Chad, one of the cornerstones of French policy in Africa.
China has said it would like to see a free, fair and transparent referendum in Sudan. And with the Sudanese foreign minister having met with the Chinese twice in just a matter of months, it's very clear that Sudan is dependent on China and China is invested in Sudan. And the big reason is because of oil. Sudan has oil, or to be more accurate, South Sudan has the oil and North Sudan has the pipeline. And the two sides need to be able to get along to create a stable political environment so the Chinese can buy the oil. If all three parties get along, then all three parties win. Now, Chinese oil companies do have a certain level of political influence in the country, and with Khartoum having very few international friends, what China says might actually matter.
The Russian and Sudanese governments have maintained close ties over the years, but it's a relationship that's grown much closer ever since Vladimir Putin came into power in the late 1990s. Russia has objected to independence for Darfur. It's also objected to UN peacekeepers being stationed in Darfur too. The country's joined a long list of nations that have strongly criticised the International Criminal Court's decision to indict President Omar al-Bashir over allegations of genocide and human rights violations. Still, Russia is Sudan's principal ally in Europe, its principal investor also. And an example of that growing relationship was seen very recently at the beginning of December, where Russia said that it would help Sudan to obtain debt relief from external creditors. Russia is watching South Sudan's referendum very closely indeed. It said that despite whatever the results may be, it will invest in the north and in the south also. It's open to economic development projects in the coming future. The Kremlin are most certainly watching developments in Sudan very closely indeed. There are, of course, lucrative opportunities to be made there.
Ruqayya Abusharaf is with us to analyse some of this now. Considering how both sides need and rely on oil, do you think it could be used to bring peace and stability to the country?
Definitely, and I think people in the north and the south should draw some useful lessons from countries that had successfully utilized oil and oil revenues to build their communities, to empower their communities, and to redistribute in an equitable way.
Because at the moment it's a bit of a curse, isn't it? It's not going to those who need it the most.
That is precisely...
And it's been exploited by the wrong people.
The case. That is precisely the case in both regions, and that is what a major rethinking needs to be focusing.
This is actually happening already, that North and South Sudan will be used as proxy battlegrounds as countries from all over battle for Sudan's vast oil wealth. Do you think Khartoum and JUBA really care about being used in that way?
At this point, we need to just be patient and find out what is going to happen after January 9th, so that we do not really make a sort of a generalization about what is expected, rather than just wait and see how this will play out.
What do you make of Bashir's call to focus on agriculture?
To rehabilitate the idea of Sudan as being the breadbasket of the Arab world. And that has a lot to do with it. The Sudan, the north and the south, has greatest potential fertile lands, exploitable lands. And this is where there is a lot of interest right now in terms of food security. So what is happening in the Sudan has wider implications, as we said, locally, regionally, and internationally.
Thank you for that. Now let's take a look now at two of the leading figures in Sudanese politics. In a moment, we'll focus on the life of John Garang, a figurehead for the southern struggle. But first, a profile of the man who was once a close ally of President Bashir, now one of his main rivals in the north, Hassan Turabi.
Sudan's Islamist movement, as it stands today, was built by Hassan al-Turabi. And now, with Sudan seemingly set to split, he remains a strong advocate for southern self-determination. A fierce intellectual, he studied law in Britain and gained a PhD from the Paris Sorbonne. He then became the Dean of the Faculty of Law at Khartoum University in 1964. As a leader of the Sudanese Islamic movement, he won a seat in parliament. His fierce opposition to the former strongman Numeri landed him in jail for about 7 years. During the democratic period of 1986 to 1989, he managed to build the Islamic movement as the main opposition party. Omar al-Bashir took power in 1989 in a bloodless coup organised by the Turabi movement. Turabi in turn began pulling even more political strings. He was portrayed by many as the godfather of the new regime, but his rivalry with President Bashir once again landed him in jail. In 1999, he and his movement broke away and spoke out. Turabi would spend much of the last decade in prison. While free in 2007, he told Al Jazeera where he would lay the blame for Sudan's bloody past.
Centralization, actually. When you have a dictatorship, it means a monopoly of all power and all wealth. Of course, it's an old tradition, centralization in the Sudan. It's the British.
Today, he's a tough critic on human rights, calling for civilian government and supporting a voice for the South. Turabi is also known for his revolutionary religious views. Some have called him the Martin Luther of Islam.
A charismatic military leader who rose through the ranks, John Garang was a soldier first and foremost. He spent more than 20 years at the head of the Sudan People's Liberation Army. But while his revolutionary path put him at the center of the aspirations of the southern Sudanese, John Garang was a reluctant politician. He was born in 1945 into the southern Dinka ethnic group. His life as a rebel started in the 1960s, but he rejoined the government forces in 1972. They sponsored him to do military training in the US, where he also obtained a PhD in agricultural economics. Then, in 1983, as an officer sent in to negotiate with 500 southern soldiers refusing to deploy in the north, he ended up joining them. Over the next 2 decades, he kept what became the SPLA together through turbulent times. And when the conflict, which claimed nearly 2 million lives, ended, Garang was appointed Sudan's first vice president, but he lasted just 3 weeks. A mysterious helicopter crash in 2005, claiming his life and plunging the peace process into new uncertainty. An enigmatic leader whose ideological views were unclear, Garang was known to favor a united Sudan. 5 years after his death, the South is on the verge of the autonomy for which many of his followers were fighting.
Well, one woman who's familiar with both of those characters and the potential crisis facing Sudan is JENDAYI FRAZER. She was US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in the Bush administration and is now professor at Carnegie Mellon University. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us. Do you think Khartoum will let the country split if that is indeed the outcome of the referendum?
I definitely believe that the January referendum will go forward. And the likely outcome of that will be succession, and that the Khartoum government will have to accept that outcome because it will be respected internationally.
What do you make of Omar al-Bashir's threat for the full implementation of Sharia law? What's the motivation behind that?
I think they're trying to get the best deal, so in many ways they're playing chess at this point with their public statements.
So how much of a proxy battleground will North and South Sudan become?
I think that the North will continue. It has a history of muddling through, basically making tactical steps rather than taking strategic decisions. And in this case, I think that after the referendum and the move to separation, that the North will continue to try to undermine that, partly by saying that it was putting legal cases against the referendum, saying that somehow it was flawed. But secondly, doing what they often do, which is to destabilize the South so that the South can never really become a very viable and very strong state.
If this destabilization leads to some sort of tribal conflict, whether it comes from the North or within the South, what role do you think the U.S. will take?
Well, the United States has under the Obama administration has played the Sudanese game, the northern game. In other words, they're basically in a tactical for tactical dance with the South. They're also not taking strategic decisions. For example, on Abyei, they've essentially allowed the North to hold Abyei hostage, to go forward. They're prepared to go forward with the January Southern Sudan referendum while ignoring essentially the Abyei or allowing it to be held hostage. And so if the North goes to a destabilization campaign, the United States will use public diplomacy, make rhetorical statements saying that the North, this is unacceptable. But I don't think that they'll do more than that. Perhaps they will train and continue to train the Southern Sudanese army, and they will continue to try to pressure the North both through incentives and disincentives for the type of negative behavior that the Northern Congress Party is likely to carry out.
How do you think neighboring countries will take advantage of this situation if there is some sort of volatility there? We know that Kenya and Uganda are smuggling arms into the country, into the south.
Well, I do think that Kenya and Uganda and Ethiopia will play a very strong role trying to support and back the Southern Sudanese. I would hope also that especially Ethiopia and Egypt would try to work and put pressure on the Northern Congress Party not to play this destructive game and to accept the fact that they did not make unity attractive and they have to live with that. And that means getting along with their neighbor, which would be a new Southern Sudan, a new sovereign Southern Sudan. At some point, you just hope that the North will start thinking more strategically rather than tactically. If Nafi Ali Nafi, he's clearly stated that the South will succeed. Start right now negotiating a post-referendum arrangements so that the North is not undermined by that Southern secession, but also that the two countries can go forward and live in peace and live in a productive relationship.
Does that mean then that the U.S. will then drop sanctions because that was what it promised?
I think that the U.S. definitely needs to look at removing its sanctions. Not all of them, obviously, because still in the north, you have the problems taking place in Darfur. There's a war still going on in Darfur. The National Congress Party has been bombing, aerial bombings in Darfur. And so obviously all the sanctions will not go off, but the United States needs to move immediately to take Sudan off the state-sponsor terror list.
Very good getting your thoughts. One of the leading architects of U.S. Africa policy over the last decade. JENDAYI FRAZER, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, the pace of economic growth is already picking up, but division could slow it back down again. The nation has vital resources, the proceeds of which could provide new opportunities for Sudan's 44 million people. Let's hear the views of the people in Khartoum and Juba.
If they decide to separate, they can do so, but hopefully without any conflict. I urge the politicians to be considerate because any problem could lead to fighting.
I like it to be separated because we suffered the 21 years. During the war we suffered a lot. So at least we need the country to be divided so that we shall be independent.
الجنوبيين لما كانوا هنا نحن كنا أخوان وكنا مع بعض حتى لو حصل الانفصال.
When the Southerners were here, we were like brothers. Even if the separation happens, our opinions of our brothers will not change. And if they decide to leave, that is their own choice.
We are
going to Southern Sudan.
It's good that Sudan is going to be separate, and I know Sudan is going to be separate. Why? Because for us here in the south, we actually we are not Muslims. So all of them, they are Muslims. If we say that we vote for unity, they are going to introduce the Sharia law.
Thanks for joining us for an in-depth look at Sudan, a nation at a crossroads.